Every spoonful of sugar you stir into your coffee carries the legacy of an industry that once consumed millions of human lives to make something so simple taste sweet. It's white, it's pure, it barely has a flavor beyond sweetness itself. But behind those small crystals, sitting in kitchens across the world, lies one of the most brutal chapters in human history. Sugar was never just a seasoning. It reshaped the map of the world, built empires, helped finance the Industrial Revolution, and cost countless human lives over several centuries. For a small pleasure on the tongues of a privileged few, millions of others paid with blood, sweat, and their entire lives. This is the story no one tells you while you're stirring sugar into your cup. The story doesn't begin with cruelty. It begins with an ordinary plant growing deep in the rainforests of New Guinea more than 10,000 years ago. Native peoples there chewed on its stalks to draw out the sweetness inside. None of them could have imagined that this small plant would one day cross continents and oceans, becoming one of the driving forces behind one of humanity's greatest tragedies. Sugarcane spread from New Guinea through Southeast Asia and eventually reached India. It was there that humans discovered the technique that changed everything, boiling cane juice until it crystallized into white grains. And it was there, too, that the word itself was born. The Sanskrit word for it was sarkara. Arab traders who carried the crop westward turned it into sukar. Italian merchants who bought it in Mediterranean ports called it zucchero. The French softened it into sucre, and by the time it reached English tongues, it had simply become sugar. A single word that had traveled through 4 languages and 3,000 miles before it ever touched a plate in Europe. What was once sticky, perishable liquid became something that could be stored, transported, and valued like treasure. When Arab armies expanded across the Middle East and North Africa, they carried the knowledge of sugar with them. Cane fields began appearing along the Mediterranean coast, and sugar started inching its way toward Europe. When European crusaders marched into the Holy Land, they encountered something entirely unfamiliar. They called it the precious sweet salt, and when they returned home, they brought stories of this strange white crystal with them. Long before a single sugar plantation existed in the Americas, it was the merchants of Venice and Genoa who controlled the flow of sugar into Europe, sailing it in from Cyprus, Crete, and Sicily, and selling it for prices that only royalty could afford. A single sugar loaf, the solid cone in which refined sugar was sold for centuries, could cost as much as an ordinary laborer earned in an entire month. European royal courts became obsessed with a sweetness their own continent's plants could never produce. Sugar became a symbol of power and wealth, valuable enough that nobles carved it into elaborate sculptures to display at banquet tables, announcing their riches to every guest in the room. Some banquets even featured entire sugar sculptures shaped like castles, ships, or coats of arms, standing taller than a child, pure spectacle meant to be sliced apart and eaten by the end of the night. It was common enough for wealthy households to keep their sugar locked away in cabinets, guarded like jewelry. But there was a problem. Europe couldn't grow cane itself. The climate was too cold, the soil unsuitable. As demand kept climbing and Venice's monopoly kept prices sky high, it became enormous pressure on Europe's great powers to find new land where this crop could be grown on a massive scale. But before a single stalk of cane ever grew in the Caribbean, the model that would define the next 4 centuries had already been built, on a tiny island most people have never heard of. In 1486, Portuguese sailors landed on an uninhabited volcanic island off the coast of West Africa called São Tome. The soil was rich, the climate tropical, and the Portuguese planted cane almost immediately. But cane alone wasn't enough. To work the fields and run the mills, they brought enslaved Africans across a short stretch of ocean from the Kongo and Angola. And within a few decades, São Tome had become something the world had never seen before. A plantation economy built entirely on imported human labor, producing a tropical crop purely for a distant European market. It was, in effect, the prototype. Everything that would later unfold in Brazil, in Barbados, in Jamaica, in Saint-Domingue, was first tested on this small island. By the 1530s, São Tomé was the largest sugar supplier in the world, its mills running day and night. Its enslaved population repeatedly worked to exhaustion and replaced. Uprisings, disease, and the exhaustion of the island's soil eventually broke the system, and Portuguese planters shipped their equipment, their financing, and their entire method of production across the Atlantic to a colony with far more land to offer: Brazil. By the mid-1500s, Brazil had become the largest sugar producer on Earth, and a template first perfected on a forgotten African island was now running at a continental scale. When sugarcane finally reached the Caribbean a few years later, it wasn't introducing something new. It was extending a machine that had already been built, tested, and proven devastatingly effective. In 1493, Christopher Columbus's ships carried cane cuttings from the Canary Islands into the Caribbean for the first time. The soil there was rich, the climate hot and humid, almost as if the plant had been made for this land specifically. European merchants and nobles saw an enormous opportunity. They began clearing forests, burning land, turning lush green islands into endless cane fields. But growing sugar wasn't like growing anything else, and this is where its particular cruelty deepens. Once cane is cut, the sugar inside starts breaking down almost immediately. Within a day, sometimes within hours, the juice sours and the crop is ruined. That single fact dictated everything about how the industry was run. Cane couldn't wait for tomorrow's shift. It had to be cut, crushed, and boiled in one continuous, punishing rush, which meant plantations needed enormous numbers of workers on call at all times, especially during harvest. It's the reason sugar became among the most labor-intensive plantation crops in the Americas. The indigenous populations who once lived across the Caribbean were nearly wiped out by disease and brutal treatment. Plantation owners needed a massive new labor force and turned to the same source and the same system, already running in Brazil and West Africa. It was a system designed with cold, ruthless efficiency, running like a machine. Ships left European ports loaded with guns, cloth, and rum, sailing toward the coast of West Africa. There, that cargo was traded for human beings, men, women, and children torn from their own villages, chained and forced aboard ships in conditions no person should ever endure. Below deck, there was no light. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, waste, and salt water, trapped in a space so tight that some could neither sit up nor turn over. The heat became unbearable within hours. The sound of chains never stopped, and the groan of the hull against the waves became the only rhythm of time for weeks on end. They crossed the Atlantic in what history would later call the Middle Passage, and countless died at sea before ever reaching land. When the ships arrived in the Caribbean or Brazil, the survivors were sold into slavery on sugar plantations. The sugar they produced was shipped back to Europe, and the ships returned to Africa for another human cargo, a cycle with no end. Historians estimate more than 12 million people were forcibly taken across the Atlantic through this system, and a large share of them were sent directly to cane fields, because sugar plantations demanded more labor and inflicted more suffering than almost any other industry of the era. Life on a sugar plantation was a machine that consumed human lives as fuel. Workers woke before sunrise and labored until well past dark. During harvest season, some were forced to work around the clock because cut cane had to be boiled immediately or the sugar inside would spoil. The boiling house was the most dangerous place on the plantation. The fires never went out. Accidents with the crushing mills were so common that some plantation owners kept an axe mounted right beside the machine, ready to sever a worker's arm the moment it got pulled into the rollers. On some of the largest sugar estates in the British Caribbean, Historians have found that a newly arrived worker's life expectancy could be measured in a handful of years rather than decades. Many owners had already calculated that it was cheaper to work someone to exhaustion and buy a replacement than to keep an existing worker alive and well. This was cruelty, reduced to a line item in a ledger, an ordinary production cost. Among the thousands who lived this reality, most left no name behind, only a number in a plantation's account book. One young man, recorded only as belonging to a Jamaican sugar estate in the late 1700s, survived barely 3 years past his arrival, before he was gone entirely from the record. His labor accounted for, his life not. Multiply that single erased name by millions, and you begin to understand what the crop truly cost. And yet, amid this suffering, human resilience endured. People sang while they worked, built secret families under impossible circumstances, and some escaped into the deep forests to build free communities of their own, known as maroon communities, some of which resisted colonial forces for decades. The sugar produced through this suffering flowed back to Europe as a river of extraordinary wealth. And that money didn't stop at the docks. It flowed into banks that financed the ships. It flowed into the earliest insurance markets, built to cover the risk of losing cargo at sea. Cargo that was, in truth, human beings. It flowed into the textile mills and ironworks of the Industrial Revolution, into railways, into factories, into the treasury of an empire that would come to span a quarter of the globe. Port cities like Bristol and Liverpool in England, or Nantes in France, grew into major centers of trade on the back of it. By the 1680s, the small island of Barbados alone was exporting an estimated 15,000 tons of sugar annually, enough to make it the wealthiest colony in the English Americas, richer per acre than territories many times its size. Back home, the appetite for sweetness exploded alongside it. In 1704, the average person in Britain consumed about 4 pounds of sugar a year. By 1800, that number had climbed to 18 pounds. By 1901, it had reached 90 pounds per person, a roughly 22-fold increase in 2 centuries, driven by little more than the growing habit of sweetening a cup of tea. Sugar didn't just sit at the edge of the economy, it ran through its foundations. But no system built on injustice lasts forever. By the late 1780s, the French colony of Saint-Domingue had grown into the richest sugar colony on Earth, producing around 40% of Europe's imported sugar and 60% of the world's coffee, from a single island worked almost entirely by enslaved hands. In 1791, hundreds of thousands of those enslaved people rose up in revolution. Napoleon sent tens of thousands of soldiers to crush the uprising and restore French control over the colony's plantations. He failed. Disease and fierce resistance broke his army, and in 1804, the rebels declared Haiti the first free nation in history, founded through a slave revolt. The defeat cost France more than an island. Without Saint-Domingue to anchor his ambitions in the Americas, Napoleon abandoned his plans for a French empire in the New World altogether, and sold an enormous stretch of the continent to the United States the very next year, in what became known as the Louisiana Purchase, doubling the size of the young country overnight. A slave revolt on a sugar island had just redrawn the map of North America. The shockwaves reached Europe too, helping ignite abolitionist movements that had been growing for years. Britain banned the slave trade in 1807 and abolished slavery across its colonies in 1833. But abolition didn't end the plantation's hunger for labor. It only changed its disguise. In the British colony of Mauritius, on the very day slavery legally ended there in 1834, plantation owners had already arranged for a new workforce to arrive: indentured laborers from India, brought in on contracts that bound them to years of work in the same cane fields, for wages barely enough to survive on. Colonial officials called it the Great Experiment, proof, they claimed, that free contract labor could replace slavery. Over the next 80 years, more than 1 million Indian laborers were transported under this system to sugar colonies across the British Empire, to Mauritius, to Fiji, to Trinidad, to Guyana, most under contracts that were extended, renewed, or simply never honored. Tens of thousands more were brought from China and elsewhere. Many never saw home again. The ships changed. The paperwork changed. The word slavery was formally gone. But in the cane fields themselves, harsh discipline, dangerous mills, and exploitative plantation conditions often remained for another 2 generations. It would take until 1888, when Brazil became the last country in the Western Hemisphere to officially end slavery, and until 1917, when Britain finally shut down the indenture system, for the plantation's long chain of forced labor to fully come apart. Today, sugar sits in every kitchen on Earth. It's cheap. Anyone can buy it. No one looking at it thinks of ships crossing oceans in chains, of a forgotten island off the coast of Africa, or of the millions who crossed the world under contracts that promised freedom and delivered something close to its opposite. The next time you stir sugar into your coffee, remember this. These tiny white crystals became one of the most valuable commodities crossing the Atlantic, built empires, helped finance the Industrial Revolution, and quietly reshaped the course of human history, again and again, for over 400 years. History rarely disappears. Sometimes, it simply dissolves into our coffee. If you want us to dig into the hidden history behind other everyday goods, chocolate, tobacco, or diamonds, let us know in the comments below. And if stories like this make you want to see the world in ways no one's ever told you before, don't forget to subscribe, because there are many more truths still waiting to be uncovered.